the Ionian to Rome, to Italy, and so forth. But everything from the Fertile Crescent, the Mesopotamian Valley between Tigris and Euphrates River, from India, from China, from Japan, from all these areas, everything that traveled to Rome came through Antioch. It was a multicultural city. And when the Christians got there, they began to preach to the Greeks, the Gentiles, those who were not Jewish. And, of course, they'd also gone to Cyprus, or men from Cyprus and Cyrene. Cyrene was northern Egypt. And these people from Cyprus and Cyrene date back to Acts chapter 2, because they were there on that occasion in Acts 2 on that day of Pentecost. So those who were scattered were preaching Jesus. And when they got to Antioch, they preached Jesus to the Gentiles. And that makes Antioch the first true integrated church. Now, there were people from all nations in the church in Jerusalem, but they were Jews or proselytes. That means they were not born as a Jew, but were converted to Judaism and went through following the law of Moses. And there were people from all over the world there on the day of Pentecost. And so Jerusalem church was a little bit integrated, but they were all Jewish in background, some by birth and some by training. But in Antioch, we have an integrated church. There were Jews there, born and proselyted, but also Gentiles, those who had never come into the Jewish faith. And they were the ones that made this an integrated church. It was a diverse church. There were people there from all over the world worshiping who had not come through Judaism first. But when they heard the preaching of the Lord Jesus, they obeyed the gospel. Now, when the Jerusalem church heard about this, because the grapevine's working pretty well, there were people traveling back and forth. They sent Barnabas. Now, we run into Barnabas in chapter 5, where he had land on the island of Cyprus and he sold it. He was a Levite from Cyprus. That's where he was born and probably raised. He was a man of encouragement. That's what his name means, the son of encouragement. And so he was sent to Antioch. He's the one who brought Saul into the apostles and said, look, he did see this vision. He did convert. He is a Christian. He is one of us. He's not here to persecute. And so he was the one who was kind of a go-between for a lot of these folks. But Barnabas was sent to encourage the church in Antioch, and his encouragement was, with a resolute heart, remain true to the Lord. On one occasion, a friend of mine quit going to church. He just quit. He got mad over something silly, like what color to paint the bathroom or something like that. Somebody said something, didn't sit well with him, so he just quit. His wife said, you need to come visit him. So a friend of mine and I, we went. We got up, pulled up in the driveway. He said, let me start the talking. So we got in there and we did the necessary stuff about the weather and the ball game, those kind of things. And finally he said, let me ask you a question. Why did you quit the Lord? He looked kind of stunned. He said, I didn't quit the Lord. He said, well, if you were going to quit the Lord, what would you do different than what you've done? That hurt. But you think about it. We've got folks who have quit. We may be sitting in the pew, we may be watching online. We may be doing a lot of things that keep us kind of associated, but in our hearts, we have quit the Lord. And if you think you haven't, then answer this question. What would you do different if you wanted to quit the Lord? Barnabas recommended to all the brethren that with a very resolute heart, a sincere heart, they remain true, faithful to the Lord in all aspects of our lives. Now, Barnabas, he says, was a good man, full of the Spirit, full of faith. And because of his presence, as well as them preaching Jesus, many were brought to the Lord. So the church in Antioch was a church that was growing by leaps and bounds. And Barnabas saw quickly he needed some help. And it was time to get Saul out of hiding. So he goes to Tarsus, finds Saul, explains to him the need, brings him to Antioch for a number of reasons that I don't think Barnabas understood, because God had a plan for Saul. And he had to get him out of Tarsus to get him going. So Barnabas was the facilitator in God's plan for that. So he fetches Saul from Tarsus. And I've got the date up here. This is about A.D. 42 to 43 that all this is going on. The church was established around 30 A.D. So 14, 15 years or 12, 13 years have passed by. You say, well, wait a minute, I thought it's always 33. Our chronology is off by 4 or 5 years. We follow a system that was set up by a bishop named Usher in the 1200s. He did the math and did all the figuring, but he missed it by a few years. We've uncovered the mistakes, but it's easier to live with a mistake than try to change it. Now, I asked a class one time, I said, so this is actually not 2021 after the birth of Christ. This should be 2025. Oh, well, if that's the case, I would. No, you wouldn't. Changing the name of the year doesn't mean anything different. It doesn't mean you be older. It just changed the name of the year. That's kind of like, I think it was Saint-Tropez that asked the question, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you are? You'd be the same age you are. Ignorance doesn't change that. But anyway, so this is about 42, 43 A.D. after the birth of Christ. So, verse 26, the disciples were called Christians. For the first time, this word was coined and used. And that's important because if we call them Christians, it has some meaning to it. The name Christian, the Sunday school definition, is belonging or like Christ. That's what we learned in kindergarten, in Sunday school. To be a Christian means you're like Christ. Actually, it means belongs to Christ. That suffix, the I-A-N, added to the end, designates ownership and belonging. They have been called disciples. But now you've got to explain. Disciples of whom? They've been called brethren. Brethren of whom? They've been called saints. Sanctified by whom? But the name Christian says it all. But there's more to that. In the original, the word translated were called, which the Greek word is krematizo. I couldn't write that on the screen. If I did, you would know what it was. You'd say it's Greek to me. It's Greek to me too. But the word krematizo implies that it was a name given by God. This was not something they dreamed up. They didn't sit around one night and say, you know what, we need to change our name. We need to have something that's more descriptive and definitive than disciples or brethren or saints. No, this is a name that God gave. And in Isaiah chapter 62 and verse 2, Isaiah says, and you will be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord will designate. God called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees, got him down to the land of Canaan, made all these promises to him, and one day said, I'm going to change your name from Abram, which means father, to Abraham, father of many nations. And Sarai, I'm going to change to Sarah, which means princess. Now Isaac came along, no name change. Jacob comes along, and one night coming back from Padan Aram with all of his wives and flocks and children and everything, God meets him and has a wrestling match with him. And in the wrestling match, they kind of wind up in a scissor lock with both of them holding on. Neither one wants to let go. And the angel that he was wrestling with, which was actually Jesus, said, I'm going to change your name to Israel, which means wrestled with God. So God changed Jacob's name, which is probably pretty good. You know, children of Jacob's okay, but the land of Jacob, the Jacobites, used to Israelites, it kind of sings, works a little bit better. So changing his name to Israel was an indication that he belonged to God. And so there's some other name changes God makes, but here's the one that's most important. God gave the name Christian to these disciples so that they would have this particular designation. The name Christian means it's called by God. They were called by God as a Christian. In Acts chapter 26 and verse 28, as Paul was speaking to Herod Agrippa, Agrippa said, "Almost you persuade me to be a Christian." To be a Christian not only means you're called that by God, not only means that you're called by God to be a Christian, it means that you've got to be persuaded. And here's back to that resolute heart to remain true to the Lord. To be a Christian means that you're persuaded to do that. And there's not anything that's going to change that persuasion, because it's something that comes from the heart and you live from the heart throughout your life. Now, faith is fickle, right? It goes up and down. We have highs and lows. But persuasion is long term. And then Peter says in 1 Peter 4 and verse 16, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him glorify God and not be ashamed. The name Christian is not something to be ashamed of. However, we have people who stand around the water fountain, sit and visit over a cup of coffee. We have no text. But we talk about the weather. We talk about politics. We even disagree. We talk about sports. We talk about work. We have our persuasions and our disagreements. Why don't we talk about Jesus? That, my friends, is fulfilling the Great Commission. Well, I don't want to carry my Bible. Don't carry your Bible. They didn't have a Bible. They went around preaching Jesus. They started off with, did you realize that Jesus died, was buried, and was resurrected on your behalf, in your stead, in your place, and for your salvation? They didn't have all the answers. They didn't have all the text. They just had a persuasion. And any of us, I'm going to step on our toes now. You go to the store and you find a bargain. What you going to do? You're going to tell somebody about it. Did you know that you can buy that item at this store at this price this week? It's on sale, and I loaded up. I think that's what happened to the toilet paper last year. You think about that. We find where something is, we find a bargain, and we start spreading the news. Folks, you got a bargain in salvation in Jesus Christ. And if we're persuaded that God called us to be His child, then we should be willing to not be ashamed, but to share that news with friends and neighbors. Moving on. Acts chapter 11, the last paragraph, verse 27. Now at this time some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. Prophets meaning preachers. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. And in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of their brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders of the church in Jerusalem. Now, Agabus shows up later making another prediction, but the word prophet simply means preacher. They had sent Barnabas to encourage the brethren. He'd gone to get Saul to teach the brethren, but they needed more. And so the church in Jerusalem sent some preachers down. One of them was Agabus. And Agabus, through the Spirit, foretold that there would be a severe famine. The reign of Claudius was known for a number of famines. And in the year 40, getting my date right here. There we go. Claudius was emperor from 41 to 54. He succeeded the crazy Caligula. And there was a very severe famine in the year 45. So Agabus, a couple of years before, foretold this, and the brethren in Antioch decided that they would send some financial relief to the church in Judea. You think, well, why? Bear in mind that a lot of the people who were present on the day of Pentecost never went home. And the church in Jerusalem was quite large. Although many had left because of persecution, when the famine hit Judea, Jerusalem was severely hurt. The people were starving to death, but the church took care of its brethren. And so the church in Antioch decided they would send to help. Now, they sent based on their ability. In proportion that they had means, they sent a contribution to Judea. How much should a Christian give? I heard of one preacher who demanded that his church members bring to him their income tax forms so he could verify that they were giving 10%. How many of you think that's none of his business? And how many of us wouldn't call him back the next week? Well, true. We think of that as personal information. The Jew was required by God to give a tithe, a 10% of the produce of his land. And so we say, well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to get 10% because that's what God required of the Jews. What you miss is that God required they give first fruits. That's in addition to the 10% of the harvest. God required that the firstborn be given or redeemed of man and animal. There were other gifts and sacrifices that were given throughout the course of the year, separate and apart, individually separated from the 10% of the harvest. 10% is a good place to start. It's a terrible place to stop. And how many of us have found money? Think about it. We dig around under the sofa and we found some spare change. You know what? You hadn't missed it. It was there the whole time. I was cleaning out my truck one day, running the vacuum cleaner, the shop vac. I heard something flattering. I kind of got down and looked, and between the seat and the transom there was a $100 bill. I thought a while, how'd that get there? Then I remembered a few weeks before, I had dropped that $100 bill between the seat and the transom. And you know what? I hadn't missed it. So how much can we really give if we just quit thinking about it and think about how much we're going to miss it? I know of one individual who was laid off. The company went on a strike. Came home, sat down with his wife. And she looked at him and she said, what are we going to do? Because they weren't going to get paid as long as the strike was going on. He said, first we're going to increase our contribution. For most of us, that would have been the very last thing we'd have done. Then he got his lawnmower and started cutting grass to earn the money to increase his contribution. When the strike was over, he kept his contribution going up in a proportion to the means that they had. So I think we need to look at our finances. And a lot of times we say, well, I got the house payment, I got utility payments, I got the car payment, I got the insurance payments, I got this payment, I got that payment. Well, I got this much left over. I'll give some of that to God. Why not start off with, this is how much God gets, I'll live on the rest. I'll figure it out. When we do that, God will bless us. I promise you that. Acts chapter 12. In Acts 12, we'll read about Herod, James, and Peter. Let's begin reading together. About that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. And that was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. On the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains. Guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and woke him up, saying, "Get up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Gird yourself and put on your sandals." He did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." He went out and continued to follow. He did not know what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. And when they passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for sure the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. When he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. They said to her, "You're out of your mind." She kept insisting it was so. They kept saying, "It's his angel." But Peter kept knocking, and when they'd opened the door, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, "Report these things to James and their brethren." And then he left and went to another place. Herod Agrippa the first is the Herod involved here. Now let's back up just a little bit. Herod was a family name. Herod the Great, the beginning of all this mess, was the Herod when Jesus was born. He was king of all Palestine, and he had worked that out because he had courted a great deal of favor with Augustus, the Roman Caesar at the time. He played a lot of political footsie, I guess you could say. Herod was part Jew and part Idumean. Now that doesn't mean anything, but Idumeans were descendants from Edom. Esau, the brother of Jacob, the Israelites. Okay, kind of a lot of that tied together there. So Herod was part of that. So he understood the Jews because he was part Jew. But because he was politically ambitious, he courted all the favor with the Caesars and got himself in position and got himself appointed to be king over all of Palestine. When he died, he separated his holdings, his kingdom, to 4 sons. Philip was given Trachonitis and Iturea. Archelaus was given Judea, and I can't remember the other two. But when Jesus came back from Egypt, Joseph found out Archelaus was in Judea, so he wouldn't stay there, went on back to Nazareth. Things were a little bit better up there as far as the Herods were concerned. Herod the Great was a cruel man. He had 10 wives. Some of them he killed. He killed several of his children, including the father of Herod Agrippa, the one we talk about here in Acts chapter 12. So he was a kind of a crazy guy in a lot of ways. Herod Agrippa did the same political footsie stuff with Caligula and then with Claudius, and had himself appointed as king over all of Palestine. So he had back his grandfather's holdings after this little space in between while Jesus was running around the neighborhood. He was grandson of Herod the Great, courted the favor of the Jews as well as of the emperor. It was Caligula who wanted to put a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem. And Herod got him talked out of it. And it was Claudius who wanted to do something else kind of similar, and Herod talked him out of that. So he was in pretty good favor with the Jews. And so he figured he'd take part in the persecution of the Christians. Arrested many of them, and he had James, brother of John, son of Zebedee, put to death with the sword. Now that's generally interpreted that he was beheaded. To the Jews, that was terrible. And since it happened to a Christian, they were very well pleased. Crucifixion is bad. Being beheaded by the Roman government, that's worse. But since it was done to him, it was good. That's how they viewed it. And when Herod saw that was good for the Jews, they all liked that, he arrested Peter. Said, one down, we got several others, we'll do this to Peter. But we see how the Lord intervened and got Peter out. It's interesting that one verse is devoted to the death of James. Several verses devoted to the death of Stephen. You remember one occasion in the discussion of who's going to be the greatest, James and John, or their mother, depending which gospel you read, came to Jesus and said, we want to be on your right and your left hand when you come in the kingdom. We don't care which. James can be right, John can be left, John can be right, James, we don't care. We just want to be your right and left hand men. They were part of the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. They were the ones who saw the transfiguration. And Jesus asked them, are you willing to be baptized with the baptism that I'm to be baptized with? In other words, are you willing to suffer like I'm going to have to suffer? Yes, Lord, we will. Are you sure? And I think it's noteworthy that making that promise, and Jesus said, I can't grant you sit right and left. But in that discussion, James is the first of the apostles to die. John is the last. And John is the only one who died of natural death. Now, that may be a point there, maybe not. All the commentators seem to think so, but that's okay. So Peter was imprisoned. The angel came and let him out. He was sleeping between two soldiers, chained to them. They did not want Peter to get out. He had 4 squads of soldiers running around the clock, keeping watch over him and guarding him. There was nobody going to go and get Peter out of jail. But in the middle of the night, the angel comes in. I could just see the angel. Get up, Peter. Just kicking him. Wake up, boy. So Peter wakes up. What? I'm fast asleep. I'm going to die tomorrow. I need my rest. Get up and put your clothes on. Let's go. Where are we going? That just, Peter still thought, well, this is a vision. I'm having a dream. And he walked past the guards. Now, were the guards asleep? I don't know. Were they invisible? I don't know. I wasn't there. But they walk past the guards. They get to the iron gate that's locked, and it opens by itself. Now, when a door opens by itself, what do? You look at it. Because you're kind of curious as to how that happened. And you wonder, was it not latched? Is there a ghost? Is somebody pulling a string on the doorknob, trying to pull a trick on me? If it closes by itself, okay, the wind blew it. But if it opens by itself, something's funny going on here. Peter just walks on through. Did the gate close behind him? Doesn't say. He walks about a block, and the angel disappears, and Peter says, wait a minute. Where are my chains? Where are my guards? Why am I out here seeing the moon and stars shining? Oh, I've been rescued. So it goes to Mary's house, possibly the same place where the Last Supper was held. John Mark, the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark, who travels with Paul and Barnabas and traveled also with Peter later on. One very important in the history of the church, although it takes a kind of a back row. The church is there praying for Peter. Be careful what you pray for, and don't be surprised when God answers. He's knocking on the door. So Rhoda goes down. Who is it? It's me, Peter. She takes off back up. You see, she runs back upstairs. Peter's at the gate. Peter's at the gate. No, it can't be. So we're here praying for him. But he's at the gate. You're out of your mind. He just kept knocking. So they all go down. They're all surprised. And Peter said, y'all be quiet a minute. He explains what happened. He doesn't go in. He explains what happens. And he goes somewhere else. But notice verse 17. He said, report these things to James and the brethren. Why tell James? James is dead. or it's a different James. This is James, the Lord's brother. James, the son of Zebedee, is often called James the elder, or James the bigger, because James, the son of Alphaeus, one of the other 12 disciples, is called James the less, thinking he was maybe smaller than James, the son of Zebedee. But for whatever reason, there's this nickname. But there's another James. When Jesus went to Nazareth and began preaching in the synagogue, they began to ask, wait a minute, who is this guy? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother and his sisters and his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, aren't they here with us? Where did he get this knowledge? He can't be this smart. He grew up here in Nazareth. Yeah, I changed his diaper when he was a baby. I taught him in kindergarten. The ladies said, on and on the list went. And Jesus said, a prophet's not without honor except in his own country, and he left. But they named James, who is an elder of the church in Jerusalem by this time. He also is the one who writes the book of James. Simon, James, Joseph, there we go, Simon, and Judas. Judas is the one who wrote the book of Jude. He shortened his name because of the similarity between Judas Iscariot. At least that's our assumption. So go tell James. And then Peter left. The next morning, no small stir occurred. Verse 18, when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. When Herod searched for him and had not found him, examined the guards, ordered that they be led away to execution. Then he left Judea, went down to Caesarea, and was spending some time there. The soldiers were executed because they let a prisoner go. And these were not Jewish soldiers. These were Roman soldiers. So now we've gotten away from the temple guards that were used by Saul in his persecution to the Roman soldiers, because Herod, being the Roman appointed governor or ruler of Palestine, had the Roman soldiers at his disposal. He had them executed. They'd let a prisoner escape. Verse 20. While he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, of Phoenicia, remember, with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. He ruled them, basically. And on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. And they kept crying out, the voice of a God, not of a man. And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the later part of the first century, wrote about Herod that on this day he got up early in the morning and put on a completely silver garment. That is, a garment made out of silver. Now, you'd think it'd be kind of hard to walk with that, but he did. And he went out, and the sun was glistening off that silver. The people were awed by him. Now, bear in mind, these were not God-fearing people. These were idol-fearing people. There we go. And Caesar, or Herod, began to make his speech. Because of them trying to gain his favor and gain peace and gain mercy, they began to give these accolades. It's the voice of God, not of man. And instead of Herod saying, no, I'm just a man, he accepted that and took that glory to himself. And God, having had all he could stand, he sent his angel to kill him. Now, as we read this, it looks like it happened immediately, but Josephus points out that he had intense stomach pains. Lasted 4 days in severe agony, 5 days, before he died, being eaten by worms. Now, did he already have them? Did the angel put him in there? I don't know. Sad way to go. But it does highlight the idea that you need to give God the glory when God deserves the glory. Verse 24. The word of the Lord continued to grow and be multiplied. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they'd fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who is also called Mark. Not because of Herod, but because of all that God was doing through the preaching of Jesus to the world. The Word of God was growing. The church was growing. People, more and more, were obeying the gospel as the Great Commission was being fulfilled. And Barnabas and Saul go back to Antioch. And that sets the stage for chapter 13 and the beginning of Paul's great missionary work. The Great Commission, making disciples. Our church, Vaughn Park Church's mission vision statement is that we are living for Him, speaking about Him, and serving in His name. And as you go back and read chapter 11 and 12 very carefully, you'll find the Christians were doing just that. They were living for God, living for Jesus, speaking about Him. They were serving in His name by giving themselves in active service to our Lord. May we all follow their example. God bless you. I hope you have a great and wonderful week. You're dismissed.